Oh, you can't lose your salvation. A true Christian would never lose their salvation.
Typically in these conversations, they'll never actually engage what Jesus has revealed about the nature of salvation. So if we were to go somewhere like John 6, verse 37, for example, where Jesus says, all that the Father has given me will come to me, and those who come to him, he will never cast out. And so when actually speaking about the nature of salvation, text where Jesus and the apostles explain the security of the believer, they will never walk through. Instead, it's a bunch of whataboutism.
Are you telling me that if you were to unalive somebody or commit adultery and died right after, that you would go to heaven?
This sort of argument is reductionistic because it points to one instance or one scenario and says, I can't conceive of how this could be the case. Therefore, it must not be the case. And as Christians, we're called to be more mature than that in our thinking. We should develop biblical categories. We should instead ask the question, what did the apostles teach? And how should we apply their thinking to this scenario?
And before you interject with, but a truly saved Christian would never do such a thing.
So this is where the apostles' teaching comes in. What do they teach us about such a scenario? 1 John 3, verse 9 tells us, no one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he's been born of God. 1 John tells us that if our life is marked by egregious habitual sin, then the conclusion is not, I've lost my salvation. It's that I've not been born again. I've not been born from above. So in most cases, when such heinous acts come from those who identify as believers, the apostolic categories are not, hey, they must have fallen away or they've lost their salvation. It's they probably weren't born again to begin with.
I guess you haven't read about King David in the Bible. King David was called a man after God's own heart, and he had enough faith so as to stone Goliath. And yet after that, he still slept with a married woman and then unalived her husband. If King David died immediately after that, no, he would not have gone to heaven. It wasn't until quite a bit after, when King David confessed his sins to Nathan the prophet, that he said God had forgiven him.
The Lord didn't extend to David at that point eternal salvation, because the narrative isn't about the categories of salvation provided by the new covenant. This sort of misuse of the Old Testament is characteristic of these sorts of arguments. They're not actually asking, what do the scriptures intend to communicate here? They are starting with their position and trying to prove it by using scriptures out of context. The nature of David's salvation is important to ask. No apostle points to David's life in this way. In fact, Paul uses David in precisely the opposite way to compel the Jews in Rome to trust God to save them by faith. So he says, how do we know that we are justified by faith? Well, look at David, the epitome of ungodliness. Paul wants to prove that God justifies the ungodly. So where does he go? He goes to David's life, because the apostolic use of King David is to show that despite his sinfulness, he was justified by faith. So we need to become clearer thinkers of Scripture, and we need to understand Samuel is not trying to present to us categories of salvation for the new covenant. Instead, we need to recognize it's building our anticipation of our need for Christ, our need for God's salvation, the only one who could justify and keep the ungodly, because that's the point of David's life. Yes, David was par excellence the example for Israel, and he himself too sinned deeply. And so his hope is not that he was able to merit his salvation by his own righteous works, but that by faith, God would justify the ungodly, of whom David is one more example.